really appreciate everyone for joining us today. We're very excited to, talk with you today about insider tips and tricks to your virtual job interview. How all of us have endured, the last 2 years. We definitely have entered more of a virtual world. So excited to dig into best practices. But to introduce myself, first, my name is Molly Kaplan, and I am our Northeast Region Corporate Recruiter here at Medix. I've been here for about 6 years now on the internal recruitment team for about the last 3. And it's been definitely a rewarding experience to be able to bring in, new teammates into our organization. And in the last 2 years, it has been, mostly in a virtual capacity with virtual interviewing and virtual hiring. So excited to, dig in a little bit more to help with the virtual interview preparation. But now I will pass it over to our 2 guests, Michelle and Larry. We are very thankful for you joining us today. But Michelle, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michelle. I'm the Career Readiness and Internship Specialist at Cal State Long Beach. And so what I do is I work with students to help them prepare for the career and internship process. So interviewing is definitely one of those things. And then also work with our employer partners to help to cultivate relationships and opportunities. So happy to be here today and to hopefully share some helpful tips for you. And I'll pass it over to Larry.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Hello, everybody. I'm Larry Quinn. I'm the chair of the Marketing and Sales Department at High Point University. I'm also the director of the Professional Sales Program here. I've spent 30 or 40 years as a hiring manager in sales and business, and now I teach it. It's one of the major focuses of the sales program, preparing for a career in sales, interviewing, et cetera. So I'm also happy to be here. Looking forward to talking with you all.
Awesome. Well, thank you both again for joining us today. And to begin here with our topic, we do want to start it off with our first poll question, which we will put up here for responses. Have you had experience with a virtual interview before? And we'll give a few moments for results here. All right, so 91% was yes, which correlates very well to, the survey that we actually have seen with Indeed, in fall 2021. Actually, 82% of employers have adopted virtual interviews for candidates in response to the pandemic, and 93% of those respondents actually said they expect to continue to utilize virtual interviews moving forward as well. So as we all can see, most of us have been going through the virtual interview capacity here. But now, just to dig in a little bit more here with Michelle and Larry about virtual interviewing, from your experience with, your students, what have you been hearing from them, when it comes to virtual interviews? Like, do they typically like them more, dislike them more, and maybe any common mistakes students have noticed with virtual interviewing?
Yeah, so I think definitely in the beginning, as we were transitioning to this virtual space, it was a little bit jarring and difficult to start doing a lot of this stuff virtually. So connecting with people, figuring out the technology, all of that, I think there is definitely a learning curve. As we're about 2 years into this, I think people are definitely feeling much more comfortable in that virtual interview space or in that virtual space. So what I've been hearing from students now is some of them even prefer the virtual interview. There's some benefits, you don't have to travel. There's less anxiety about making sure you get somewhere on time. And just kind of feeling more comfortable interacting with others online and virtually. In terms of common mistakes, I mean, some things that you do still want to keep in mind is that you do want to prepare as if you're going in person. So that does mean like putting on the whole outfit, pants and everything as you're, preparing, and that when you feel like you feel good, you also do well, right? That kind of body-mind connection with your virtual interviews. I think I'll leave it there and I'll let Larry kind of add some things first.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I agree completely with what you're saying. I've heard the positives about lack of anxiety of having to travel. On the other hand, the sharpest ones say that it's more difficult because they can't read the energy in the room like you can when you're face to face. They can't play off the person like they would physically if they're both in the same room. But to your other point, it's still a sales meeting. You're selling a you, and there are 7 or 8 things that we teach you that a professional does to distinguish yourself in a sales meeting, online or in person. And we'll talk about those later as well.
Yeah, no, all great feedback. And, one thing that really stood out to me, Michelle, when you were talking about, and Larry, you brought it up too, right? There's more of that comfortability, or, it's easier now to, show up for the interview because you don't have to travel. Just from a scheduling perspective too, I feel like it's easier to move more quickly, but I also think it's very important to still prepare, like it's an in-person interview, right? Like logging into the virtual interview a few minutes early, dressed professionally, of course, but also being ready to sell yourself, like
Yes.
you are in person.
Yes.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for that advice. And now just going into more so on how you can prep for an interview. Well, prep for a virtual interview. So what would you say is best to prepare for a virtual interview, or what advice have you shared with students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think you should prepare for a virtual interview like any other interview. Like whether you're in person or virtual, kind of the process is pretty similar. You first want to do your research. So you want to research the organization, the role, and make sure that you understand what are some of the expectations, what are the values, the missions, the purpose of the organization you're going to interview with. And then making sure that you're preparing some responses to common questions that might be asked. So you definitely want to do your preparation, whether you're in person or virtual. Some things that you may want to think about in the virtual space is, things like your background, your connectivity, what's happening around you, making sure you're in a quiet space, that you're able to focus and concentrate. There's not lots of distractions, and you have a stable internet connection, right? And then so also thinking about practicing. So I think sometimes in that virtual space, you may get distracted looking at yourself or looking at the other boxes, and you may get thrown off. So I think practicing, so logging in with a friend, a career counselor, faculty member, and maybe running some mock interviews can also be helpful in preparing for the interview, or the virtual interview.
And I've got some, I agree 100% with all of those. I've got some softer items, which are super important when you consider that this is a sales call and you have to distinguish yourself from the other sales execs, that is candidates, who are going to interview with the same buyer, hiring vice president. And the stakes are very high for her. If she makes a mistake on which one of you she chooses, she could lose her job. If you don't get the job, you think your world's over. So this is very high stakes. And one of the keys a pro makes before she makes a sales call, where she could lose her job if she doesn't get the order, is to first go inside herself and prepare herself mentally. And by that, I mean to focus on her goodness and what a valuable soul she is and how much she likes herself. What she can't do is look at yesterday when she failed 3 times, or for the past 6 months when her boss said, one more strike and you're out. You can't think about yesterday. There is no yesterday. In selling, all that matters is the next step. And good companies will explain that to you in your performance review. The second thing I asked them to think about is preparing themselves with their attitude towards others. In person, picture yourself knocking on the glass door and the VP says, come in. And you walk in. Those who are not professional come in thinking, oh God, I hope she likes me. I hope I look good. Oh boy, I don't know. Versus a pro who comes in like Molly did today to this call and goes, oh, there you are. Hi, I'm Larry Quinn. I've been looking forward to meeting you. You see, it's about her, not you. And the more you can make her feel like, really? You think I'm important? Actually, I do. And I see you went to Cal State. I have relatives who went there. What year did you go there before we get started talking, if you don't mind? She goes, really? You checked me out? Of course you did. You looked her up. Well, give her the respect of saying that you think she's very important and you kind of like her, which goes along with how you feel about yourself. So now it's two friends talking. Another thing you could think about, of course, is as Michelle talked about, is your appearance and your posture and your promptness and your manners, your background. But then think about your focus on the other person as you're talking. We talked about making her feel important and warm and that you really like her. Now think about, as you're answering her questions, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. You think she's asking about yourself. Consider maybe she's asking about how you can help her save her job. So it's about herself. So as you talk about your strengths and weaknesses, relate them to the research Michelle recommended you do. And I think because of that aggressiveness, I can be quite helpful as you open the new branch in Nashville. Secondly, my leadership skills would help a great deal in this dysfunctional team you have in New Jersey. I know they're dysfunctional. Everybody's dysfunctional in New Jersey. And I could help out with that. And so your answers are focused on her, just as your attention is focused on her. And then finally, and these are huge, you have to close the sale. This is a sales call. And to close the sale, you don't say, will you hire me? You ask, I'd love to come back and talk more about how I can help Medix succeed here in Chicago. Could we come back next Tuesday? Could we schedule another one at 10 o'clock on the 3rd? That's a close. And if she says yes, you now got the order and you're okay. And then finally, as we all know, you must send a reply before the sun goes down. Don't do it tomorrow when you remember. Do it tonight. So your email's okay. I don't like text, but if you send me an email and you use polite words, that's good. And then 3 days later, I want to see one of those little note cards your mother made you buy when you thank grandma for the pajamas after Christmas. I want to see a note card addressed to Mr. Quinn with a stamp on it and written, and be careful, don't write with your left foot like a lot of kids do. Nice penmanship and drop it in the mail. They know you don't have stamps. So if you did that and you went out and got a stamp, wow, you really do like me. So lots to think about. You got to get the order. You got to get the order.
Awesome. Thank you, Larry. And thank you, Michelle, for that great advice. And I feel, Larry, just going off of that full, start to finish, right? Having that note at the end, same as having an in-person interview, right? Don't lose those best practices that you had beforehand. Now just going virtual. I think it's still very important to have the contact information and prepare to do that. And then just going off that as well, like I think, just going off of confidence, and Michelle and Larry, you both brought this up, being confident in what you prepared, right? Prepare to talk about yourself, prepare questions to ask the team. And I feel the more confident you are, the more likely you will be to keep that eye contact, right? And have that open conversation. So that's like the biggest piece of advice I typically give, candidates going through our process here at Medix before a virtual interview is just, come prepared, have questions, and be ready to have an open conversation and bring that energy to the call to sell yourself. So really appreciate your great advice. And now we will go into our second poll question here. That we will pull up for responses. The question is, what platforms have you used for virtual interviews? And we'll give a few moments here before going through the results. All right, so we see 80% Zoom, which from what I have heard as well, I know Zoom is a very, very common platform. Here at Medix, we use Google Meet, but there's a lot of different virtual platforms out there now, of course, especially the last 2 years, we've been hearing a lot about them. But of course, different companies are going to use different platforms and also have different processes with their interviews. Just to use Medix as an example, what we're doing with our candidates, initially we have 2 phone interviews that are actually over the phone, no video. And that's where we're really digging into the nitty gritty with the candidates, asking them questions about their background, their job search, and really digging in with leadership. And then our final step is the virtual shadow interview. So since our dynamic, and we do this through Google Meets, should have probably mentioned that, but we typically like to make it more so, one-on-one shadowing with teammates and really a chance for the candidate to, understand the team more, understand the culture, and interview us in a way too. So it really leaves it to more of an open conversation when it comes to the virtual shadows, because we already dug into any, the more challenging interview questions on the phone interviews. But yeah, that's definitely why too, when you're having those open conversations with teammates on our shadow interviews, it's really, really important to have those questions prepared and be ready to talk about yourself, but make it more open. The team wants to get to know you, ask, different teammates, why they chose their specific career paths, and just really digging into the roles itself. But yes, that's a little bit about how Medix does their process. I know it's all a little different. I know a common, virtual interview platform as well, with Zoom right now, right? The panel layout, seeing our 3 faces here. And I really do think the eye contact piece of it, right? Engaging with each panel, right? Being one person, being asked questions by multiple. I think it's important to have that confidence, keep that eye contact. But I do have another question for you, Larry and Michelle. Have you heard from your students, like any specific, like common interview questions or anything about the platforms that they're using as well?
So I can answer that second question first. So anything about platforms, I think if you are going to be doing an interview on a platform you're not familiar with, to make sure that you give yourself extra time to log in. So some platforms may require that you like download something or add something to your web browser in order to launch. So just making sure that you give yourself at least 10 minutes or so to log in and update or download anything you need to if you're using a platform you haven't used before. In terms of common interview questions, I think even in the virtual interviews, some of those questions are similar. It'll be something along the lines of, tell me about yourself, or are you interested in this position? That Larry had shared some really great examples of responses before. And then organizations will typically ask a behavioral question and a situational question, right? So the behavioral question is something like, tell me about a time when you took on a leadership position and what happened. Right? And this idea that past behavior can help predict future behavior. So organizations want to know, like, how did you handle situations in the past? What are the skill sets that you've used? And how may you apply that to the work that you would be doing with them in the role that you're interviewing for? And then another type of question they may ask is a situational question. So they may say, okay, imagine if your supervisor gave you some constructive feedback. What would you do with that information? And so they want you to kind of think on your feet and problem solve and see how well you maybe handle a high pressure situation. And so with any of those, usually a recommendation is utilizing what we call the STAR approach, right? So answering your question in this formula of situation, task, action, result. Sharing the situation you were in, what were the things that you were asked to do or complete, what were the specific actions that you took, and making sure that you're incorporating kind of those keywords and highlighting key skill sets like communication and teamwork, collaboration, and then the positive, ideally positive outcome and result of your example, right? So those situational and behavioral questions, and then like variations of the, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, types of questions. And then students should be prepared to answer some variation of like, why do you want to work with us? Right. So being able to talk specifically about the organization, why they're interested in how they see themselves fitting in. Yeah. And I'll pass it over to Larry.
Spot on. The STAR answer is classic at any age. And the answer to the question, why do you want to work for us, is one. And let's say the job is in sales. That's what I talk about all day. Why would we pick you as a salesperson? What makes you think you could be the best at sales here? So you really have to have your answer. First of all, the answer, and then focus it on the questioner's career. And so that requires the research that Michelle talked about. It's so key. Most of the situation questions that I've heard from my students are rational, and they're important, and they tell a lot about you. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time when you were with a team member who always phoned in sick and never did anything, pulled her weight. How did you handle that? And so we want to know those. Every once in a while, you get a recruiter who gets cocky and gets ahead of himself, herself, and they ask you a silly question. Finish this sentence. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. Finish it. Well, if you're in a room and someone challenges you with an irrationality, call them on it. So, that is the silliest question I've ever heard. Why would you ask me that? Ask them. You'll say, well, you're required. I want to hear your answer. If he's adamant, call me on the phone. I want to tell you later what to say to him. But challenge, call him on it and say, that's just silly. Do you have another question? So be that proud of yourself. If you're proud of yourself, it'll affect how others feel about you. So be proud of yourself and be well prepared, like Michelle said.
Great. Yep. Thank you for that advice, both of you. And also to go off of that too, like if, let's say there is like a question and like sometimes too, like, let's say connection was in and out, right? And you didn't hear a question, right? Or, you need it repeated. Like the best way to go about it is just to ask, right, politely to repeat the question or ask them to elaborate like what they're looking for as well. But all great advice. And also going back to Michelle, what you were talking about, I feel, it definitely is important, because most final interviews are when you're doing this virtual interview, right? And getting to actually see the faces of leadership and faces of teammates. This is really your chance to really sell why you want to work at Medix or XYZ company. So being prepared on, talking about your experience from the day after shadowing teammates and what stood out to you. But awesome. So now going to, the last step here of, virtual interviewing, right? And we talked about this a little before, is, after the interview, what do you do? There, are more steps, right? You don't just log off of a virtual interview. You can definitely take a breath, but, there's more you should do. And I know Larry touched on this before, with sending notes, but, just to dig in a little bit more, Larry and Michelle, how would you typically recommend your students to follow up with an employer after the interview? And, how long can they typically expect to wait to hear back?
Yeah, like Larry mentioned, I think definitely sending at least a thank you or follow-up email within that day or at least 24-hour period of your interview is definitely important. And in that follow-up, you don't want to just say, thank you so much for your time. I hope to hear from you soon. But you want to bring up some things that you talked about in that interview, kind of reminding them, the connection that you made, the things that they've mentioned to show that you were actively listening and participating in that interview. I love how you mentioned on Fridays, the team gets together for, a happy hour or social. I think that's such a great way to build camaraderie or develop, a great work environment in the office or something. So whatever it is that you guys had discussed and maybe talked about, you want to reference again to show that you were, actively listening and participating. And then, bringing up some key things that you want them to remember about you. I feel that my strong research skills and my proven sales experience will make me an ideal candidate in your XYZ role. So just kind of reiterating and reminding them of some of the key things that you bring in. And I mean, depending on how the conversation went, and there's different recommendations about this, but you could decide whether or not you would like to then go on LinkedIn and connect with that recruiter, trying to find them, maybe connecting with them. And so if this opportunity doesn't come through, maybe there may be additional options in the future. So as when you're connected, you're able to kind of find out about those or reach out about opportunities later on. And then maybe things like following the company on LinkedIn as well. And so you're up to date of different things that may be happening.
One additional point. In a sales call or in a relationship meeting, you really never know what's going on in the other person's mind. Particularly in a job interview, you, the interviewee, at the end of the interview, you almost are tempted to act passively so you don't appear to be too aggressive. And so if the interviewer says, well, thank you, Larry, and we'll be getting back to you. And all you say is, well, thanks very much. And you go home and write your email. What you really want to know is, what did she think? And so ask her, but think about it before you do, and ask in a coaching mode, which shows a lot about your character too. Well, thank you, Ms. Kaplan. And I've totally enjoyed this. I feel after listening to everything about Medix, it's a wonderful match for me. So let me ask you, do you think that I'm a wonderful match for Medix?
Well, thank you both for sharing that. And I know we're running out of time here. It's 4:30, but definitely wanted to take the time to thank you both for joining today and helping our attendees with our virtual interview tips. And I also want to pull up here. We do have a slide with our contact information. Please feel free to connect with all three of us on LinkedIn, or reach out directly as well with any questions. And I also just want to say that if you have an interest in Medix, in recruiting or sales, we are actively hiring, and I can definitely connect you with our team also. So please feel free to reach out. But thank you all again for joining us today, and I wish you the best of luck with any of your future virtual interviews.